Tēnā koutou katoa, e mihi ana ki anai tahu, te iwi mana whenua o kunei. Ko te pokoko mataraka o, ko Stuart Brock, tōko ingoa, no reira, tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Stuart Brock. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this very special occasion to celebrate the promotion of Heather Dyke to Professor at the University of Otago. These lectures are a highlight of my week, as I'm sure they are of many of you too. They're a wonderful opportunity for us to come together and listen to our new professors talk about their personal journeys, their research platform, and the impact their research has had on others. Tonight's lecture will be a very special one for me. I've known Heather for many years as both a friend and a colleague. We're both philosophers, and I've always deeply admired her and her work. I know you're in for a treat tonight. I'd like to welcome colleagues, students and friends from across the university and beyond. I'd like to give a special welcome to Heather's family who are here with us in person this evening, to her husband Ian, to her son Damien, to her daughter Ruby, and to Ruby's fiancée Maddie. I'd also like to welcome those members of Heather's family and whānau who are joining us via live stream this evening. From France, her sister Clara, her brother-in-law Martin, and her nephews Kit and Francis. From England, her brother Daniel. From Scotland, her aunt Alethea, her cousins Hamish and Bruce. From Australia, her godmother Maggie and her cousins Alice and Kingsley. And from New Zealand, her cousins Jeremy, Rafe and Hamish. It's not easy to become a professor at the University of Otago. In order to be promoted to that level, candidates need to show that they are outstanding in each of three categories: teaching, research and service. Heather has clearly met all of these criteria. It's an honour and a privilege to congratulate her tonight for that outstanding achievement, and I hope you'll join me now in doing the same. And I just want to say, if I wasn't holding this microphone, I'd be clapping vigorously now. So I invite you to welcome. Thank you, and you'll have plenty of opportunities of doing more of that tonight. Today's date is a significant one for many of us, and not just because Heather is delivering her IPL. On this date, 24 years ago, 19 Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes in the United States, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center, causing their collapse, and another into the Pentagon. The 4th plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. In total, 2,996 people died as a result. I remember vividly hearing the news of the attack that morning. The memory is so clear, it feels like just yesterday. And I'm sure it does for many of you too. But let's situate this event, the one that seems so close in time, within its temporal context, so to speak. This was a time when no one streamed music through Spotify or movies on Netflix. Instead, they listened to music on a CD and watched movies on a DVD rented from Blockbuster. We still had corded phones at home and in the office, and when we were out, we used phone booths and payphones. People sent telegrams, used fax machines, and regularly posted letters and postcards through the post office. And we all used paper maps rather than Google Maps to navigate our way around a city. Remembering these things about 2001 makes it seem so remote, such a long time ago. A human perspective about time then can be misleading. One might therefore be tempted to conclude that our experience of time cannot accurately represent it. In her lecture tonight, Heather will share with us some of her deep insights on how we can reconcile our subject-relative view of time with an objective subject-neutral view of time, both of which, she claims, need to be accounted for. This is a topic Heather has been researching and teaching about for the last 30 years. Tonight, though, Heather will not only discuss her research, she'll also reflect on her academic career, tell us a little bit about her own personal journey, and about the impact of her research on the profession, on her teaching, and most importantly, on her students. But before she does that, I'll hand over to Emeritus Professor James McLaurin to formally introduce Professor Heather Dyke and give you a little more detail about her personal and academic journey.
Kia ora koutou. Professor Heather Dyke was born in Philadelphia. Her parents moved back to England when she was 2. She grew up in Hampshire, moved to Kent. As an adult, she lived in the north of England for about 8 years, then moved to London, and finally here to Dunedin. And if you know Heather, you know that this is home. This is the place she loves. Heather took her PhD from Leeds, and she arrived at the University of Otago in 1998, 1 year before I arrived at the University of Otago and was delighted to discover in her a philosophical kindred spirit. Heather has a deep fascination with the interplay of philosophy, science, and human experience. She has many philosophical interests, but she's internationally renowned for her work on philosophy of time. If that doesn't mean much to you, it's about to. But briefly, philosophy of time is a fundamental area of metaphysics which explores the nature, perception, and representation of time, as well as its relationship to things like consciousness, causality, and experience. Heather's work in philosophy of time is very much transdisciplinary, linking philosophical analysis to disciplines like physics, psychology, linguistics. This work has been extraordinarily successful, attracting analysis from some of the biggest names in philosophy, people like J.G.C. Smart and Hugh Mellor. Heather is author of Metaphysics and the Representational Fallacy with Routledge and Time with Cambridge University Press. Her edited collections include Wiley Blackwell's prestigious Companion to the Philosophy of Time, co-edited with Adrian Barden. She's widely published and heavily cited in top international philosophy journals, including the Philosophical Quarterly, Analysis, the AJP, Synthese, as well as top specialist journals such as Mind and Language and Biology and Philosophy. Humanities programs, like philosophy, as many people in this room will know, rely very much on individuals who are prepared to go the extra mile, solve problems, build new courses, develop new areas of research, and breathe life anew into disciplines that sometimes can feel a little bit embattled. Heather is a champion of philosophy. She's given a huge amount of time and energy to philosophy at Otago and to philosophy as a discipline. She was elected president of the Association of Philosophers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in 2024. She's head of the philosophy program here at Otago. Heather is a talented and dedicated teacher, both at undergraduate and postgraduate level. She's also a great communicator of philosophy outside academia, particularly through her work with ABC Radio in Australia and shows like The Science Show and The Philosopher's Zone. The philosophy program is incredibly lucky to have her. Heather is a brilliant scholar, a real scholar's scholar. As a long-time research collaborator, I can tell you that working with Heather is exciting, enlightening, and a huge amount of fun. In a recent teaching evaluation, Heather was finally anointed Girl Boss. On a personal note, she is a great and steadfast friend, since I and my family met her and her family a long time ago. And if all these achievements seem like a huge amount for one person in one life, through all this, Heather has faced and fought cancer twice. She is a remarkable woman. I think she is the most courageous person I know. Heather Dyke.
Tēnā koutou e hoa mā, ka mihi atu ki a korua I a korua kupu whakataki. No ingarangi o ku tupuna, kua oa te wā o toku noho ki konei, ko otipoti toku hokaianga inai nei. Koutou kua tai mai nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the introductions, and to all of you for coming, both in person and online. And I want to also welcome my friends and family all across the UK who weren't named but who are watching. Thanks for being there. I have so many people to thank. I'll try and keep this bit short. I want to thank members of the philosophy department at Otago since 1998. You have provided such a wonderful community of lively, funny, friendly, philosophically robust and razor-sharp colleagues. It's been an honour to work with you all. But especially I want to thank Alan Musgrave. Alan, you were the best mentor I could have had at that crucial early stage in my career. I would not be here if it were not for you. I also want to thank all my students over the years. Teaching and supervising has been a joy and a privilege. But most of all, I want to thank my family, Ian, Ruby and Damien. You three have made this all possible and worthwhile. Otago Whakaihu Waka, the University of Otago, truly is the best place in the world to do philosophy, and I feel enormously privileged to have spent so much of my life here and to have been enabled to do the philosophy that I've done here. Philosophers want to understand everything. The word philosophy literally means the love of wisdom, not wisdom about any particular subject matter or in any particular domain, just plain wisdom about everything. But I've come to think over my career that this quest for understanding manifests itself, broadly speaking, in two philosophical tendencies. And sometimes those tendencies can pull us in different directions, or they can clash and seemingly generate inconsistent views of the world. On the one hand, there's the tendency to understand the world as it is in itself, independently of us, the world out there, independently of how we view it. When we follow this tendency, we are seeking a third-person view of the world. This tendency characterizes a lot of scientific investigation. Physics and astronomy, for example, seek to understand the nature of reality from very small scales to very big scales. Physics and astronomy textbooks don't include much about what things are like around here, about now, and for beings like us. They want to get at the truth about reality as it is independently of us. Think of geology and some areas in biology. These subjects are about the workings of aspects of the world and how they operate independently of us. Had humans never evolved, there would still have been geological and astronomical facts in the world. I call this the tendency to subject-neutral understanding. It's understanding that seeks to extrapolate away from human interests in the world. It seeks to achieve a God's eye view of reality, or, as Thomas Nagel famously put it, a view from nowhere. When we're pulled by this tendency towards understanding, we're seeking a view of reality sub specie aeternitatis, that is, a way of understanding things that transcends time and specific circumstances and focuses on universal and timeless truths. On the other hand, there's the tendency to understand the world as it appears to us, from our distinctively human perspective. This gives us a first-person conception of the world. This tendency also characterizes much scientific investigation. Sciences such as psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience are interested in how humans and other animals think about the world and act in the world. It also characterizes much investigation in the social sciences. Politics, religion, and sociology are very much about humans and how they relate to one another. Other subjects in the arts, history and literature, for example, take a human-centered perspective in their investigations. I call this the tendency to subject-relative understanding. It's a tendency to understand the world as it appears to us. It seeks a view of reality that very much takes time and place and our specific circumstances into account. Philosophical investigation exemplifies both tendencies, and in this I think it is somewhat unusual. Some areas of philosophy are driven by the subject-neutral tendency. Philosophers who study such topics as the nature of matter and substance, space and causation are interested in these features of the world as they are independently of us. But other topics in philosophy, such as the nature of free will, agency and knowledge, are driven by the subject-relative tendency. Free will and agency are, on the face of it, important features of what it is to be human. But there are philosophical problems connected with these features, and philosophers try to untangle these problems to arrive at the truth about what it is to be free and what it is to be an agent. Knowledge, too, concerns our relationship to the world. The objects of knowledge, the things we know, are often independent of us, they're out there, but for there to be knowledge, there have to be knowers, that is, subjects who know things. I mentioned before that these two tendencies can pull us in different directions, and that can create tension and philosophical puzzles. One chief area in which this tension manifests itself is the philosophy of time, which has been the focus of my work for my whole career. What is the nature of time? St. Augustine famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if no one asks me, I know perfectly well what time is, but as soon as someone asks me what it is, I'm stumped. In our everyday lives, when we're not thinking about what time is, it's just there in the background. It's a sort of organizing principle for our lives. But when we stop and think about it, what features do we think it has? I've been thinking about time for so long that I've lost all my pre-theoretic intuitions about time. But in my decades of asking undergraduates this question, answers usually coalesce around the following key features. Time divides into past, present, and future. We live in the present moment, we remember the past, and we anticipate and plan for the future. Time seems to be dynamic in some sense. It's like we're on a boat, on a river, heading towards the future and away from the past. Events flow past us, starting off in the future, becoming present and moving away into the past. Alternatively, we're forever riding on the present moment as if it were the crest of a wave, heading towards the future and leaving the past behind us. These are metaphors, of course, but it's generally thought that they represent something true about the nature of time. But these features capture how time seems to us from our temporal perspective. It gives us, if anything, a subject-relative or first-person understanding of time. When we consider what science tells us about time, we get a very different picture. According to the scientific picture, there is no division into past, present, and future. Science does not recognize an objective present moment, and there is no sense in which time is dynamic. According to the scientific, or the subject-neutral perspective, time, or space-time, is more like a static block universe, with objects and events distributed throughout it, occupying their own unchanging temporal locations within it. Events stand in temporal relations to each other. World War I is earlier than World War II, for example, and nothing about those relations ever changes. The temporal relation in which these two events stand to each other is permanent and unchanging. But how can both of these pictures be true? How can time be both dynamic and static? How can there be and not be an objective present moment? Following both philosophical tendencies leads us into paradox and confusion. I was always a philosopher. I think most children are. They want to understand the world, why things are as they are, why they have to behave in certain situations, why the sky is blue. They don't discriminate between the subject neutral and the subject relative tendencies. They just want to understand it all. But philosophy wasn't a school subject when I was growing up. It still isn't for most school students. So it didn't become clear to me that I was a philosopher until I got to university. At school, the subjects I studied in sixth form were French, English, and maths. I chose them because they were the ones I was best at, although, as my sister and my school friends watching online will attest, I was a bit of a swot. So I was good at most academic subjects. But I enjoyed these subjects the most, and I think it was because there was some philosophy in all of them. Through French, I came across Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus, and I was captivated. Through English, I came across Shakespeare and Milton and the metaphysical poets, all very philosophical in content. I was fortunate enough to study both Hamlet and Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead. And the existentialist themes in them both dazzled and compelled me to want more. And maths was a bit like logic, another aspect of philosophy that I have loved. And according to Bertrand Russell, after all, maths is basically just logic. I have loved teaching logic in our first year paper, Critical Thinking. I still occasionally meet people who were in my critical thinking classes when I first arrived at Otago who tell me how much they enjoyed them, which is incredibly gratifying. I went to the University of Leeds in 1988 to study French and philosophy. The choice to add philosophy to French came as a result of those continental philosophers, Sartre, de Beauvoir, and Camus. But the philosophy I studied at Leeds was of the analytic variety, and I was hooked. After the first year, I dropped French to focus on philosophy. Continental philosophy takes the subject-relative approach. It wants to understand the human condition. I found that fascinating, but limiting. I wanted to understand everything. I arrived at Leeds during a period of changing of the guard in philosophy. Peter Geach had recently retired, and our lecturers comprised mostly old men, or so it seemed to me. There was Roger White, who chain-smoked his way through all our seminars. There was Timothy Potts, who gave us our marks in Latin. I once got Benet, which was apparently quite rare. And there was Peter Long, who taught me Wittgenstein and Frege. And then in my second year, a new young lecturer arrived, Robin Lepedvin. He was energetic, enthusiastic, and passionate about his subject, which was the philosophy of time. He supervised my honours dissertation and then my PhD. Two of my other teachers at Leeds were Jennifer Jackson and Christopher Coop, who both taught me ethics. They were a married couple and used to juggle being philosophers with bringing up their children. I loved studying ethics, so they were both very inspiring, but they also showed me that you could be a philosopher and a parent. After my first degree at Leeds came the first of 3 failed attempts to leave philosophy and do something else. The department at Leeds tried to persuade me to do a PhD, but I was determined. I wanted to go out into the real world and do something else. I chose accountancy. After 6 months, I was desperate to get back to philosophy, banging on the door for them to let me back in, and thankfully the department at Leeds welcomed me back and arranged some teaching for me so I could enroll in a PhD in advance of securing a scholarship. When choosing my PhD topic, I was initially torn between ethics and the philosophy of time. I'd loved both subjects as an undergraduate, as well as my teachers in both subjects. You might notice that ethics is a subject-relative investigation, examining how humans ought to live together, the moral status of their actions, and how to live a good life. The philosophy of time, by contrast, is, on the face of it at least, a subject-neutral investigation, trying to discover the nature of time as it is independently of us. But I was quietly advised that ethics was not considered serious philosophy, so it would be very much to my advantage to choose the philosophy of time. Perhaps it was good advice at the time, but I'm very grateful and glad that this prejudice against ethics has not persisted into the present day. So I did my PhD in the philosophy of time with Robin Lepedvin as my supervisor. Robin had been supervised by Hugh Mellor at Cambridge. Hugh was one of the founding fathers of the new B theory of time, the theory that I came to defend. I like to think of Hugh as my grand supervisor. As a PhD student, I was quite scared of him, but later on we became very close friends. Indeed, he was a close family friend to all of us. I had thought that in studying time, I was studying time as it is independently of us, a subject-neutral investigation. But the way the philosophy of time was carried out in the 1990s was very much through the lens of temporal language. This puzzled and bothered me. Surely, I thought, our research question was, what is the nature of time? Yet it seemed to be carried out via the intermediate question, is temporal language intrinsically tensed? I think this was the long reach of the linguistic turn, a movement that had characterized philosophy in the first half of the 20th century and which turned philosophical questions into questions about the correct logical analysis of language. In the philosophy of time, the principal research question from perhaps the 1960s to the 1980s had been whether temporal language was intrinsically tensed, or whether tense could be somehow stripped away, revealing a tenseless, canonical language which accurately described the nature of temporal reality. Tense theorists, or A-theorists, thought that time was fundamentally as our ordinary experience and language suggests that it is. There is an objective present moment, and time flows. Since our ordinary temporal language suggests that time has these features, that language must accurately capture how time fundamentally is. Tenseless, or B-theorists, thought that time was more like the scientists think it is. That is, lacking an objective present moment and any kind of dynamism. Since temporal language suggests that time is tensed, it must fail to accurately represent the true nature of time. This led B-theorists to argue that language needed to be detensed in order to accurately depict the true nature of time. But in the early 1980s, thanks to Hugh Mellor and the Australian philosopher Jack Smart, the debate changed. There was still a focus on language, but these new B-theorists came to accept that language couldn't be detensed without losing some of its meaning. Nevertheless, they argued that that didn't mean that time itself was tensed. Instead, tenseless temporal facts are all that is needed to make true any true tense sentence. Tensed sentences reflect the temporal location of the speaker, which is something that can't be stripped away from the language. But just because the language is perspectival, it doesn't follow that the temporal reality represented by the language must itself be somehow intrinsically perspectival. Temporal reality is the static block universe that I described earlier, but which tense sentences are true depends on where in the block universe you are when you utter them. This was the theory that I defended in my PhD thesis. I had met Ian in the year before going to Leeds as an undergraduate, in a year off that I took between A-levels and university. Wait for it. So young, so long ago. When I first went up to Leeds, we planned to see each other every other weekend, but that resolve didn't last a week. By the end of the first term, he had arranged a transfer with his employer to Manchester, and we moved into a little back-to-back terraced house in Huddersfield, which lies between Leeds and Manchester. For the next 8 years, we lived at various places along the M62 in the north of England, finally landing in Hebden Bridge while I finished my PhD. We then moved to London, and I made my second failed attempt to leave philosophy. After my PhD, I felt like I'd had enough of philosophy. I needed a break from it. I got a job as an editorial assistant for a women's health journal called Reproductive Health Matters. Once again, after about 6 months, I felt myself being pulled back to philosophy. I spoke to Ian and said that I would like to start applying for philosophy jobs. He said, that'd be fine if we either stay in London or move overseas for a new adventure. I applied for jobs on that basis, and the first job I was offered was here at Otago. I had applied for a job at Auckland as well, and they wanted to fly me out for an interview. Otago just gave me a telephone interview. But I had already accepted the Otago job. In retrospect, I'm extremely glad Otago got in there first. I wonder if we'd gone to Auckland, whether we'd have ended up staying as long as we did. Dunedin and Otago got a firm grip on both of our hearts, something that I doubt Auckland could have done. And Otago truly is the greatest place in the world to do philosophy. The scientifically informed, naturalistic style of philosophy that's characteristic of Australasian philosophy and has been a mainstay of philosophy at Otago suits me particularly well. But it's the natural environment too. The beauty of the landscape surrounding us here enables me, at any rate, to be productive in my philosophical thinking. We knew nothing about Dunedin or Otago when we came out here, apart from what we'd seen on an episode of one of Michael Palin's travel documentaries, Full Circle, which had recently shown on the TV. It was a segment of roughly 6 minutes in which he ran through the Leith with the students of Selwyn College having flour thrown at them. But in order to help us prepare for this big move, Alan Musgrave's wife, Julia, sent us information through the post, including copies of the ODT, junk mail that gave us an idea of the cost of groceries, and lists of rental accommodation available. We arrived at the beginning of 1998 and stayed here for the next 15 years. As soon as I arrived in the philosophy department, I was made to feel extremely welcome. I think I was a bit of a novelty, as there hadn't been a woman in the department since Gwen Taylor, who had retired about 15 years before, and there were none before her. So the department was very male and fairly adversarial, at least in the department seminars. Visiting philosophers took their ideas, reputations, and lives in their hands when presenting at the Otago seminar. This struck me as not a very productive way to generate new ideas and insights, and I did my best to make it less adversarial and more constructive and collegial. I set about trying to get papers from my thesis published with some success, and then Alan Musgrave decided I should organise a conference on any theme of my choosing. I chose the theme of the intersection between time and ethics, the two topics that I'd had to choose between for my PhD. The Time and Ethics Conference took place in 2001. The driving thought behind the conference was that ethics seeks answers to questions about the moral status of human actions and human lives. But these are temporal things. Actions are performed at certain times and are informed by past events and have consequences for the future. Lives have temporal extension and are experienced from a sequence of temporal perspectives. So you would think that answers to ethical questions should take account of their temporal features, but there had never been a systematic study of the relations between time and ethics. I invited some big names in both fields, Nathan Oaklander and Quentin Smith from the Philosophy of Time, and Michael Sloat and Jana Thompson from Ethics, amongst many others who came. I produced an edited volume of a selection of the papers from the conference, which came out in 2003. Asking questions about how temporal and ethical considerations affect each other gave the collection a distinctively subject-relative flavour. These are questions that take our human perspective as central and consider it in relation to such issues as punishment, intergenerational justice, moral responsibility, and well-being. Then, in 2007, I organised another conference, this time for Alan Musgrave's retirement. Although, as it turned out, it was a bit premature, as he didn't fully retire until 8 years later. The calibre of philosophers who wanted to come and pay tribute to Alan and celebrate his career was extremely high. Michael Devitt, Frank Jackson, John Heil, Hugh Mellor, and Jack Smart were all there. among many other stellar philosophers. I collected the essays around the theme of truth and reality, and a volume was published in 2009. I thought that was a nicer photo of that book than just showing the cover. Truth and reality seems, on the face of it, a very subject-neutral theme, and that reflected the sort of philosophy that Alan is known for, being a philosopher of science. But the concept of truth is dual-facing. It looks out there to how things are in the world, independently of us, but it also applies to our representations of the world. So it is also about us and our perspective on the world. In my blurb for the book, I wrote this: questions about truth and questions about reality are intimately connected. One can ask whether reality includes numbers by asking, are there numbers? But one can also ask, is the sentence, there are numbers, true? Such semantic assent makes it seem that the nature of reality can be investigated by investigating our true sentences. This line of thought was very much taken for granted in 20th century philosophy, but it is now beginning to be called into question. Just how much can we learn about the nature of reality by investigating our true sentences? Does, for example, the truth of there is a prime number between 10 and 20 mean that prime numbers exist? Does the truth of eating people is wrong mean that moral properties exist? Does the truth of spiders give me the creeps mean that the creeps exist? That last example was one of Alan's favourites. All this time, I had been working on my own monograph, which had stemmed from my early puzzlement about the focus on language in the philosophy of time. Why, if we're interested in the nature of time, of temporal reality, do we focus our attention on the language we use to speak about time and events in time? The position in the philosophy of time that I came to defend, the new B theory of time, holds that tense in language is irreducible, inescapable, even though time itself is tenseless. That is, we can't de-tense language. We can't speak in entirely tenseless terms without losing the ability to say some of the things we need to say. But there is no tense in reality. There is no past, present, and future independently of our perspective. So according to this view, the linguistic issues about tense do not settle the metaphysical issues about the nature of time. I began to think that if this is the case in the philosophy of time, then maybe it's also the case in other metaphysical issues. Maybe there's room in other debates for a position that rejects the move from facts about language to facts about the fundamental nature of reality. Maybe we have been mistaken in thinking that the way to do metaphysics is via language. In my book, Metaphysics and the Representational Fallacy, I argued that trying to answer metaphysical questions via their linguistic counterparts could lead one to reason very badly. One of the ways reasoning could go wrong was by committing what I called the representational fallacy. This is the fallacy of arguing from facts about language, or our representations of the world, to conclusions about the fundamental nature of reality. I argued that the new B theory shows us that there can be many ways of truly representing the world, even though there's just one way the world is. So it's wrong-headed to think that you can move from facts about a representation to facts about the fundamental nature of the reality represented. I applied this approach in other areas of metaphysics: material constitution, modality, mathematics, causation, and vagueness, arguing that it opened up space for a new position with respect to the relationship between language and reality in each of those domains. My time at Otago was fruitful in terms of collaborations with other philosophers. I collaborated with my colleague, James McLaurin, and we co-authored several journal articles and book chapters together. One of them, entitled "Thank Goodness That's Over, The Evolutionary Story," is still my most cited paper. Thank you, James. Another article we wrote, entitled "What is Analytic Metaphysics For?" proved to be quite controversial and ruffled a few feathers among the metaphysics community. We argued that a lot of work that is recognized as metaphysics doesn't really contribute to the pursuit of knowledge about the world at all, because it fails to connect with scientific inquiry into the nature of reality. And then a collaboration with an American colleague, Adrian Bardon, led us to co-edit the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to the Philosophy of Time. This was a major contribution to the literature in the philosophy of time. It collected 32 original articles about the philosophy of time from some of the most preeminent philosophers in the field. The papers were collected into 3 themes: the history of the philosophy of time, time as a feature of the physical world, and time as a feature of human experience. Ours was the first such collection to feature the history of the philosophy of time. The other 2 themes represent the subject neutral and the subject relative investigations into time. My time at Otago was fruitful in other ways too. Our children, Ruby and Damien, were born here in Ōtepoti, Dunedin. When Ruby was born, there was no statutory paid maternity leave, but the university offered 12 weeks paid maternity leave. It was not really enough. And Ian was a student at the time, so we relied on my income. But the department, and particularly Alan Musgrave, was very supportive and arranged my teaching so that I could work from home and Ruby would only have to be in daycare for 2 days a week from the age of 3 months. Things were better when Damien was born, as I was able to take 6 months leave. And then, at the end of 2012, came my 3rd failed attempt to leave philosophy. This time, it involved aging parents who needed our support. But my parents' situation was complicated by the fact that they owned a Georgian manor house, Court Lodge, in the southeast of England, that had been in our family for nearly 300 years. It was divided into flats and had become quite run down as my father had become unable to manage it properly. We made the difficult decision to go over to the UK and try and save it. The university gave me a 1.5 year leave of absence, but it wasn't enough, and we stayed for 6 years in the end. The house had originally been part of an enormous estate that had gradually been sold off, and by the time we arrived, there was nothing left to generate any income to support the house. We tried to find ways to generate income and to put the house back at the heart of the community where it had once been. We held charity events at the house and opened the garden in aid of local good causes. We invited local school groups round to tell them about the history of the house and the family who lived there. We tried to get publicity from local historical societies and local news. But none of that was going to make us any money, and it was all to no avail. We eventually saw that we weren't going to be able to make it work. One thing I had been able to do was put my academic skills to use in researching the family history. We had always known about a connection between our family and Jane Austen's family. One of my female ancestors, Margaretta Morland, married Jane's second cousin, Colonel Thomas Austen, and they're mentioned by Jane in her letters. I don't have a picture of Margaretta apart from this silhouette on the right. The lady on the left is her mother, Anne, my 3 times great-grandmother. But delving into this history revealed that the connections between the Austens and the Morlands went much further than this. Margaretta's oldest brother was good friends with Frances Motley Austen, and 5 of the 7 siblings of that generation married someone with some connection to the Austens. The house itself had actually been rented to Frances Motley Austen for 15 years, and it's very likely, although I can't prove it, that Jane would have visited the house at that time. Siegfried Sassoon, the World War I poet and writer, grew up a few miles from Court Lodge and was a regular visitor to the house. He wrote about it and the family in his Memoirs of a Fox-Hunting Man, which was a thinly fictionalized autobiographical account of his early years contrasted with his wartime experiences. He changed the names very slightly. The village of Lamberhurst became Amblehurst. The River Tees became the River Nees. And my great-great-grandfather, Squire Morland, became Squire Maundell. He describes playing golf on the golf course surrounding the house and socializing with the Maundell family, which gives a rare and treasured insight into their characters. It was a fascinating family history, and it was my family history. It was interesting from a third-person perspective, but also from my own embedded personal perspective. It was a story that I and my family were a part of. Since the income-generating aspect of the project was not going so well, I decided I'd better try and rekindle my academic career, as we might need it if the Court Lodge project failed. I got a job at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where Alan Musgrave had done his PhD before coming to Otago. I taught their first-year introductory course, which is my favourite kind of teaching. Research was not quite so productive because so much time was taken up with commuting, and we still had Court Lodge to run. London, as it turns out, is not the best place in the world for me to do philosophy. But I did give the Popper seminar, named after Sir Karl Popper, who had been Alan Musgrave's supervisor. So that felt really appropriate, like I was reforging the connection between Otago and the LSE. That was my talk at the Popper seminar. Finally, when my father died, we realised we had given it all we could, and it was time to call it a day on the Court Lodge project. Having made that decision, we also decided that we wanted to move back to Dunedin, as it was a better place for our children to grow up. So we put the house on the market and started the monumental task of packing up and emptying a house that had been almost continuously occupied by one family for nearly 300 years. People don't throw anything away. While that was going on, I had an email from James McLaurin saying that there was a job going in the philosophy department. It was at lecturer level and only fixed term, but was I interested? Having this time done my utmost to leave philosophy and kill off my career, it seemed that I was still able to resurrect it, and philosophy was still able to lure me back. Not only that, but I was back doing philosophy in the best place in the world to do philosophy. Or perhaps it's just the best place in the world for me to do philosophy. Perhaps this is a subject relative rather than an absolute universal truth. We arrived back in Ōtepoti, Dunedin at the end of 2018, and I have been teaching and researching in the philosophy program since then. I was initially worried that, given my 6 years away from research in the philosophy of time, it would be difficult to get back up to speed on how the field had progressed in that time. But I needn't have worried. It seemed that word of my return to academic philosophy got out into the philosophical community, and I was quickly being invited to write and present things that got me back in the saddle, so to speak. The most important of these invitations was to write the Cambridge Element on time. Cambridge Elements are short books that present an opinionated introduction to the current state of research on a given topic. The Element on Time was in the Metaphysics series, and this gave me the perfect opportunity to read all that I had missed and put it together with all that I had previously known and develop my own take on the state of play in the field. I was given a tight deadline of just under a year to write it, but I did it, and I'm immensely proud of it. While I was away from philosophy, the literature in the philosophy of time had begun to coalesce around attempts by B-theorists to reconcile their metaphysical view of time as involving the static block universe with our experience of time as perspectival and dynamic. So now the real question in the philosophy of time is how to reconcile the subject neutral with the subject relative account of time. In my view, time as it is in itself does not involve a division into past, present, and future, nor any flow of time. To think that it does involve these things is to commit a kind of projectivist fallacy. To argue that because that's how time seems to us, that must be how time is in itself, independently of us. But that is to make the mistake of elevating us and our human perspective to be the ultimate arbiter of the way reality is. There are metaphysical and scientific reasons for thinking that time as it is in itself is different from how we experience it. It does not contain an objective present moment, and it does not flow. Given these subject-neutral facts, how do we reconcile them with the way time seems to us? How do we reconcile the subject-neutral with our subject-relative, distinctively human perspective on time? In my view, we need to take both tendencies seriously in order to gain true understanding. We shouldn't prioritize one perspective at the expense of the other. A purely subject-neutral account of time leaves out important facts about the way time seems to us. Conversely, a purely subject-relative account of time arrogantly treats the human perspective as the only relevant story about the nature of time. My conclusion is that both perspectives have something important to teach us about the nature of time. And I think this lesson extrapolates to other areas of inquiry and other areas of our lives. Of course, our human perspective matters. It's the means by which we access the world. But the world as it is independently of us matters too. Humans are not so important. We are not at the pinnacle of existence. Our perspective on reality is not the final word on the nature of that reality. How reality seems to us may say more about us than it does about reality. Our perspective is just one among countless others. Taking both perspectives seriously and seeing how they fit together to generate a complete understanding of reality is the lesson that philosophy has taught me, and it's one that I hope I have and I will continue to pass on. Thank you. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Simone Marshall and I am the head of the School of Arts at Otago Whakaihuaka, the University of Otago. I am extremely honoured to be representing the university's leadership this evening to offer a vote of thanks and to celebrate this inaugural professorial lecture from Professor Heather Dyke. A feature of Professor Dyke's lecture this evening has been her journey through 3 failed attempts to leave philosophy. We should not be surprised by her failure because what she has revealed to us this evening is that she is driven by a desire to know, as she says, everything. And this is, as she has pointed out to us, innate in us all. And it is this desire to know everything that has drawn her back to philosophy. We have also heard about the people who have inspired and encouraged Professor Dyke throughout her career, both academic and family. Heather's lecture is a testament to this vital part of academic success. I'm in the wonderful position as head of school to be privy to the student feedback that our academic staff receive. And it won't surprise you to learn that just as Heather has been encouraged, supported, and inspired by philosophers before her, she too is an inspiration to her students. Most notably, it is her desire to know that inspires her students. I have reflected on the humanity that Heather has brought to her approach to her role, the compassion that she has brought to the relationships she has with her colleagues over the years, and more recently as head of the philosophy program. We have heard tonight that she is a world leader in her research, and I want to add that she is also an immensely valued leader at the university. It comes as no surprise to me to hear Heather say that this is the best place in the world to do philosophy. Our philosophy program is truly world class, with a remarkable international standing. Of course, Heather is too modest, qualifying this by saying, perhaps it's just the best place in the world for me to do philosophy. But what she has left out, and what all of us here can attest to, is that Heather is part of the reason that this is the best place in the world to do philosophy. Heather, we are all immensely grateful that you have finally completely failed to leave philosophy. Your presence here at the University of Otago inspires the people around you, your students and your colleagues. Professor Dyke, on behalf of the leadership of the University of Otago, I congratulate you on the attainment of our highest academic office, full professor of the University of Otago. I congratulate you, your family, your wider community of scholars on this remarkable achievement. As a representative of the leadership of the university, I am proud to welcome you officially to the ranks of the Professoriate and for us to now be considered your peers. And this is the moment where I'd like to offer you a gift, if I may. And perhaps a round of applause from everyone as well, I think.